Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt is most renowned for his captivating presence in the realm of Pan-Arab populism. His compelling radio broadcasts held audiences spellbound, fostering immense national pride not only within Egypt, but also resonating far beyond the North African borders. Abdel Nasser's defiance against the former colonial powers in Egypt not only garnered him admiration within his own nation, but also earned him international respect. Throughout the region, people rallied behind this anti-colonial passion, finding inspiration in Abdel Nasser's actions. Egypt's history is marked by the rule of various powers with significant colonial influences from both France and Britain. The British continued the legacy established by the French in their struggle for control over Egypt. British colonial administration deliberately curtailed investments in education and healthcare, aiming to hinder the development of Egyptian elites and instead promote a subordinate workforce. Now, Egyptians found it intolerable that they had limited control over their own territory. In 1922, Egypt became a recognized sovereign state with a constitutional monarchy, and a new constitution was adopted in 1923. However, in practice, these changes remained largely theoretical. The British High Commissioner maintained substantial influence, and Britain retained control over Egypt's defense. This led to an unstable power dynamic between the king, the British Commission, and the parliament, which was largely dominated by the nationalist Left Party. Abdel Nasser and several other young officers founded a revolutionary nationalist group in 1939, which they called the Free Officers Movement. While it initially lacked a structured war-oriented organization, it would later develop in the 1950s. This group was originally comprised of junior officers within the Egyptian army. Their primary objective at the outset was to eliminate Britain's military presence in Egypt. Abdel Nasser, along with many Egyptians, grew increasingly frustrated as it became evident that the British were exerting significant influence in Egypt. Now, by 1952, before Nasser and the three officers took power, Egypt was ripe for revolution. At 7 a.m. on July 23rd, Anwar al-Sadat announced the takeover on Cairo radio. On June 18, 1953, the Egyptian monarchy was officially abolished and the Republic of Egypt was declared, with General Mohammed Najib as its first president. By the end of 1954, Abdel Nasser had cemented his authority as the leader of the free officers in the country. Gamal Abdel Nasser declared the adoption of a constitution in January 1956 that transformed Egypt into a socialist Arab state, featuring a one-party political system. In June of the same year, in a presidential election with Abdel Nasser as the sole candidate, an overwhelming 99.9% of the 5 million Egyptian voters cast their ballots in his favor. He inherited a deeply unequal agrarian economy in disarray before the revolution. Less than 6% of Egyptians possessed over 65% of the country's land, and less than 0.5% owned more than a third of all fertile land. Much of Egypt's population consisted of landless, illiterate laborers toiling in the cotton fields. The 1952 Agrarian Reform Law initiated significant land redistribution, tackling wealth-based land ownership concentration. This law imposed a 200-acre land ownership limit, redistributed land to landless farmers, and confiscated royal family property to fund rural infrastructure projects, hospitals, and schools. The National Socialism program drove state-led industrialization, expanding access to education, healthcare, and employment across Egypt's society. Egypt's strategic significance lay in its position as a bridge between Africa and Asia, with the Suez Canal serving as the vital trade link between Europe and the East. In the 1950s, the Suez Canal remained vital to the British, with 70,000 troops in the canal zone. Amid the Cold War, both British and Americans sought to persuade Abdel Nasser to join an anti-Soviet alliance, but he declined. He aimed to maintain Egypt's independence without aligning with any pro-Western alliance. This neutral position raised suspicions among Western powers who viewed it through the lens of the Cold War. They were concerned that if Egypt wasn't with them, it might be against them. After World War II, the Egyptian military requested the British departure from the canal zone, but an agreement allowed British officials to retain control over the canal. This arrangement was seen by many Egyptians as a form of British imperialism, and they believed genuine independence could only be achieved with the departure of the British. On July 26, 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser formally declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, a joint British-French enterprise that had possessed and managed the Suez Canal since its inception in 1869. On the evening of September 28, 1970, Egyptian radio and television abruptly began to broadcast recitations of the Holy Quran. This was a familiar sight that something of great significance had gone terribly wrong. Later that evening, a tearful Vice President, Anwar al-Sadat, appeared on television. Though he tried to say something meaningful, all he managed to say was that Abdel Nasser was greater than words.